The rise and fall of the Brazilian Empire. Imagine a Brazil that never became a republic, a land ruled by emperors, where history took a completely different turn. Well, for much of the 19th century, that was reality. The Empire of Brazil, 1822 to 1889, was one of the most unique and stable monarchies in the Americas. But despite its success, it couldn't escape the forces of change. Birth of an empire. The story begins in 1808, when the Portuguese royal family, fleeing Napoleon's invasion of Portugal, sailed across the Atlantic and set up their court in Rio de Janeiro. This was a game changer. Brazil was no longer just a colony, but the center of the Portuguese Empire. When King João VI eventually returned to Portugal in 1821, his son, Dom Pedro, stayed behind. A year later, tensions between Brazil and Portugal reached a breaking point, and on September 7, 1822, Pedro declared Brazil's independence, becoming Emperor Dom Pedro I. Dom Pedro I, a short but intense reign, 1822 to 1831. At first, Brazil thrived under its new monarchy. Dom Pedro I established a constitutional monarchy, blending royal power with elected officials. But things weren't perfect. Brazil was massive, diverse, and hard to govern. Dom Pedro struggled with political conflicts, economic crises, and wars, like the Cisplatin War, which resulted in modern-day Uruguay breaking away. Frustrated and unpopular, he abdicated in 1831, leaving the throne to his 5-year-old son, Dom Pedro II. The Golden Age, Dom Pedro II, 1840 to 1889. After a decade of regents ruling in his place, Dom Pedro II took full control in 1840. Unlike his father, he was a wise, intellectual, and beloved ruler, guiding Brazil through its most stable and prosperous era. Under his reign, Brazil modernized with railroads, telegraphs, and an expanding economy. Slavery, although deeply rooted in the country, started to decline. Brazil remained the dominant power in South America, winning the Paraguayan War, 1864 to 1870. The empire promoted science, education, and culture, turning Rio de Janeiro into a major intellectual hub. For decades, Dom Pedro II kept Brazil stable, while neighboring nations faced constant revolutions and dictatorships. He was respected worldwide, even meeting Abraham Lincoln and European royalty. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Why did the empire fall? By the late 19th century, 3 major issues threatened the monarchy. 1. The abolition of slavery, 1888. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. When Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, freeing all enslaved people, it was morally right but economically devastating for the plantation-owning elite, who now turned against the monarchy. The military's growing influence. Many officers felt the empire didn't support them enough. Inspired by Republican ideas and the success of the US and France, they began plotting change. 3. Dom Pedro II's own apathy. After ruling for nearly 50 years, he was tired. He had no strong heir, his only son had died young, and he showed little interest in fighting to keep the throne. On November 15, 1889, the military staged a bloodless coup. Dom Pedro II, the emperor who had once been loved, accepted his fate without resistance. He and his family were sent into exile in Europe, and Brazil was declared a republic. What would have happened if the empire had survived? What would its place in the world have been? Would it have become a powerful country? What if the Brazilian Empire had survived? If the Empire of Brazil had never fallen in 1889, the country, and possibly the entire world, might look very different today. The survival of the monarchy could have had major implications for Brazil's economic development, military power, political stability, and global influence. Economic power. Had the empire continued, Brazil might have industrialized faster. During Dom Pedro II's reign, Brazil had already begun modernizing with railroads, telegraphs, and early industrialization. If the monarchy had remained in power, it could have encouraged further development by attracting foreign investment and avoiding the political instability that plagued the early republic. Stronger economy. A stable monarchy might have led to better managed industrial and agricultural policies, reducing the economic chaos of the First Republic, 1889 to 1930. A wealthier Brazil. The empire was already one of the world's largest coffee and rubber exporters. With better infrastructure and long-term policies, Brazil could have become an economic powerhouse earlier than it did in the 21st century. No economic crisis of the 20th century. The fall of the empire led to decades of political and financial instability. A surviving monarchy might have prevented some of the recessions and hyperinflation that Brazil suffered throughout the 20th century. Military strength. Brazil was the dominant power in South America under the empire. If it had continued, its military could have expanded further, possibly making Brazil the undisputed regional superpower. Stronger armed forces. The empire successfully led Brazil through the Paraguayan War, 1864 to 1870, proving its military strength. If the monarchy had continued investing in its navy and army, Brazil might have become the dominant military force in Latin America. More global influence. A stable empire might have given Brazil a stronger role in both World Wars and Cold War politics. It could have aligned itself with major powers and been a key geopolitical player, similar to how the British Empire or Japan maintained influence. Could Brazil have had a colonial empire? With a powerful navy and a stable government, Brazil might have expanded its territorial or economic influence across the Atlantic, possibly controlling parts of Africa or the Caribbean. Political stability. One of the biggest advantages of a surviving empire would have been political stability. The early Brazilian Republic was marked by constant coups, military takeovers, and short-lived governments. A constitutional monarchy could have provided a steady hand in governance, much like the United Kingdom or Japan. Fewer coups and dictatorships. Brazil experienced several authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, including the Vargas era, 1930-1945, and the military dictatorship, 1964-1985. A monarchy might have prevented these, maintaining democratic institutions. More international prestige. Monarchies, especially constitutional ones, tend to be viewed as symbols of continuity and prestige. Brazil might have had a status similar to the UK, Sweden, or Japan today, an economic and diplomatic powerhouse with a respected royal family. Stronger ties with Europe. The Brazilian royal family had strong connections with European royalty. If the empire had continued, Brazil might have been more closely aligned with Europe, rather than shifting towards the US influence during the 20th century. Global superpower. Could a surviving Brazilian empire have become a global superpower? Possibly. Here's why. Economic growth. With stable leadership, Brazil could have industrialized faster and become one of the top economies of the 20th century. Military dominance. A stronger navy and army might have made Brazil the dominant force in South America. Geopolitical influence. Brazil could have played a larger role in world wars, the UN, and global diplomacy, possibly even forming a Latin American alliance under a constitutional monarchy. A rival to the US? If Brazil had maintained political stability, strong military growth, and economic expansion, it could have been the Western Hemisphere's second superpower, challenging US. Conclusion: a different Brazil, a different world. If the Brazilian Empire had survived, the country would likely be a wealthier, more stable, and more influential nation today. Instead of struggling through political crises and economic turmoil, Brazil might have become a major world power decades earlier. The 20th century could have seen a powerful monarchy shaping South America and playing a key role in global politics. Would it have been better? Maybe. A stable monarchy could have prevented wars, economic failures, and dictatorships. Or, like many empires, it might have eventually collapsed under its own weight. One thing is certain: if the empire had survived, Brazil and the world would be a very different place today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating stories about history's greatest figures and events.